I thought a good place to start would be actually the intro music from your podcast, Conversations with Coleman.
Mm.
And I was actually going through your SoundCloud today, Cold Man, and I was interested in the type of music that you made, and I realized that the intro music from your podcast is from a song you made called Oxytocin.
Hmm.
And one of the lines from Oxytocin is, "I'm hoping that I'm not just blinded by oxytocin." And
Mm.
I've been kind of going through the deep dive into the chemical interactions in our brains that are responsible for what we call love. So I'm curious, what is your view on love?
Well, I think what I was trying to get at in that song was that when you first start seeing someone, there's this great Earth, Wind, and Fire song called "After the Love Is Gone."
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that one. Amazing song. Everyone should listen to it. But you're just in the situation sometimes where you want to know how you're feeling about someone, and it's actually difficult to parse what is just like momentary passion and what's lasting.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what that song was about. um I would caution against any, sometimes people make the argument that actually love is just oxytocin. It's nothing more than chemicals firing in your brain. And I think that's what Daniel Dennett calls a deepity, which is a statement that sounds profound but is actually trivially true.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, you can say love is just chemicals, but you're not actually saying anything. You're saying nothing more than the banality that the brain operates. What we call emotions are, or can also be understood at the chemical level. It doesn't mean they're not real.
Mm-hmm.
So I would caution against that kind of interpretation.
Yeah. I feel similarly in where I'm kind of thinking about how hard it is to recognize what you're actually feeling, and if something that you feel initially that you think may lead to love, or you think it's love, how reliable are your feelings, and how can you judge that? Because oxytocin and just the dopamine oxytocin interactions in your brain, how how can you see that as something that's love or not?
Right. No, it's definitely hard to tease out when you're with someone, and like I said in the song, you don't want to be blinded by what is at some level that gray area between lust and love.
Mm-hmm.
And especially if you don't have that much experience, if you've only been in one relationship or two, you probably don't have enough self-knowledge over long periods of time to know yourself and to know what feelings you should listen to and which ones you shouldn't. So I'm glad you
Yeah.
like that song, and I'm glad you picked up that is the intro to my podcast
Yeah,
music.
I do. I'm curious because the last thing on your SoundCloud is back in 2018, I believe. So, what made you press pause on
Before that.
releasing music publicly, at least, or if it's somewhere else, I haven't seen it, but on SoundCloud, I believe the last thing was a couple years ago.
Yeah, it's been, I took like probably a year and a half hiatus. The thing is that I've always had trouble making music while being in school. So all the music I made from 2015 onward was over the summer and spring break and winter break and whatnot. So there's always been that constraint. For some reason, I find it really hard to find time to make beats and write lyrics during the year. And then when I was, late in sophomore year is when I started writing for Quillette and being introduced to this whole new world that was very time intensive and really captured my attention in a way that it captured the small time that I had to spend on music before ended up being captured by writing. And there's a really troubling lack of connection between the writing world and the music world, which is interesting to me because, how my brain works, I've always viewed my passions as very coherent. I used to write blog posts and, make songs in the same day, and it didn't require that much of a leap for me mentally. But I think for many people, the type of person who gets their meaning in life from creating music often isn't concerned about, politics. There are obviously many exceptions to that, but in general, there's a sort of voluntary segregation between those two spheres in society. So, and there's surprisingly little overlap from the friends and connections I have in the music world and the writing world. So, yeah, it now that I've graduated, I have way more time to devote to music, and if you like my music, you'll be seeing a lot more of it soon.
Yeah. Do you think that it's music artists have a lack of interest in politics, or it's more that they form their political opinions in private and they don't really care to share it on their public platform of music, like mixed music and politics? Like someone like Kanye West, he has no problem recently coming out and breaking the mold and saying, I'm black and I'm Republican, I like Donald Trump and I don't give a shit. That started with the tweet with, I like the way Candace Owens thinks. But then you have someone like Tyler, the Creator, who I don't really know what his political opinions are, but I would guess that if he sat down on a podcast that was purely political, he'd probably have some very interesting things to say that would be thought-provoking, even though he doesn't actively distribute information in the political mainstream.
Yeah. Truthfully, I don't know what it is. I know that people like Kanye, I think, are the odd ones out. But not really, because, a lot of artists, when a black person gets shot by the police, they'll send out a tweet condemning it. Something like that, as LeBron James did recently with Ahmaud Arbery. Those aren't, full-blown political takes or larger commentaries about the prevailing concepts and notions through which people see politics. Those aren't deep dives into our unexamined assumptions about the social world. But they're sort of quick takes, and that's a little more of the kind of thing that Kanye was doing. It just so happened that he had more of a right-wing flavor to what he was saying, which is what upset a lot of people. My sense is that most people who've devoted their whole lives to creating music just legitimately are less interested or are not interested enough in these questions to try to write at length about them or speak at length about them, or they don't feel confident that they know enough about it to really give a take. And so, just like, most political commentators who like have music on the side as a hobby aren't confident enough to like put their music out there. So it's reciprocal in that sense. I think with me, the thing is, out of high school, I was 100% committed to being a professional musician, and I didn't even really consider going to schools for other purposes. So I went to Juilliard as a jazz major, and I was also very into hip hop at the time, but there are no programs for that really. I suppose there are a few, but
there are no programs for hip hop?
There probably are now, but I was really committed to, and I still love and play jazz trombone, But for me, it wasn't a hobby. It was, neither writing nor music has ever been merely a hobby for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always been confident in putting my products out there as, to compete with professionals in both spheres. So I think that's probably more rare.
How has your background in music, in taking it beyond just a hobby, affected the way that you write?
The short answer is I don't think it has. Um, they are different pursuits ultimately. When I'm making music, there is I pay more attention to my just brute intuitions. When you're making a beat, you just have to go off of your own experience, what feels good to you at that particular moment. And you shouldn't question too much your feelings. Uh, I mean that's how good music is made in my opinion. And the reason there's obviously more to it than that, because your intuitions have to be formed by experience and by having listened for hundreds or thousands of hours and like studied music. But once you have those intuitions, you should just more or less obey them. Whereas with writing, I think perhaps some people write in that kind of intuitive way, but if you're writing nonfiction, political analysis, you can't just have an intuition and you can't have a gut reaction and just follow it. You have to examine and re-examine and question and make arguments that actually feel wrong to you at first, but upon reflection are right. So I think, there, there's a kind of person who really flourishes in that rational and reflective approach, but not in the intuitive, and vice versa. So I can't really say that either one informs the other that much, other than that they both come from the same person, you know.
Do you think there's a world where you could do both, where you could go testify in front of Congress and then later that night you go on stage and you're rapping in front of, hundreds of people for a show, and one doesn't take away from the other and both crowds take you as seriously as the other one. They don't see it as something that, you know, is a reason to see you as unstable or uncredible, that you pursue music or that you pursue writing and politics? Is there a world where you could comfortably do both of those?
Yeah, I think there's totally a world where I could comfortably do both. Um, Ultimately, I think the only limit is my own imagination and my own capacity to absorb criticism from people who are unsympathetic to me as a person, who don't understand either one or the other of those two pursuits. Ultimately, you can live your life so as to minimize all possible lines of critique of you as a person, and then just die having not realized, certain desires that you wanted to go down. Or you can say, I'm gonna do what I value and what I love, and open yourself up to lines of criticism that wouldn't have been there. I think it makes way more sense from the point of view of personal happiness and life fulfillment to do the second thing. But yeah.
Yeah, I definitely feel hesitations from jumping into different areas of creating, or going into an area where I don't have any sort of status or reputation, and kind of just trying my hand at something, whether it's writing or music or podcasting. And it takes it takes a certain amount of I don't know if it's delusion or confidence or a mixture of both, but like some level of energy to get across that threshold where you just say, I don't give a fuck about how people are going to criticize me. Like you said, you're not going to worry about that line of criticism and just go and create and maybe push the boundary too much, maybe not push it enough, but then just kind of like throw things against the wall and adjust as you figure yourself out. And I I've never been someone who I thought would ever download TikTok. And in quarantine, I downloaded TikTok a couple weeks ago, and I see a lot of people doing things that make me uncomfortable, but I don't really know why, like dancing in front of a camera or lip syncing or just like doing these really creative things to get their ideas across.
Mm.
And at first, I just thought it was stupid. And then I started, following some creators that I also saw on Twitter or YouTube, and I know they create good content, and I respect what they do. And then they're also on TikTok, and so I know that there's something there. You can make it what you want, and not that every creator has to be on TikTok, but it kind of like forced me to experiment with what would be my version of TikTok that I can create regardless of whether I think I'm stupid or other people think I'm stupid. And it took a couple weeks for me to actually experiment with that video platform.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, you should. Yeah, I think I totally understand what you're saying. There's like a mixture of fascination and desire to expand yourself, and a kind of fear of making something that's cringeworthy or embarrassing yourself. I think ultimately there's often a choice or a trade-off between love and fear. You love something and you want to create in some area, but you're afraid.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've rarely regretted choosing love over fear. I've mostly regretted the opposite. So go for it, try something, and if it doesn't work out, that's okay. But ultimately, I think people underestimate how much they can learn to live with criticism. You can. It's not that. It's actually not true to say that I don't care what people think. That's almost always false. Everyone cares what people think. We are, in a very literal sense, wired by evolution to care what people think more than almost any other desire we have. But it is also possible to simply live with the idea that some people won't like your product and won't enjoy what you're doing, and accept that and learn to accept that that's one of the realities of life that's going to be unpleasant, and just live with that unpleasantness without trying to get rid of it, and without letting the prospect of more of that kind of unpleasantness prevent you from doing what you're going to do.
Yeah, the cringeworthy stuff is a good point. I think more than people just disliking what I do, I think people cringing at it or somehow viewing me as unstable or crazy is more likely to stop me from doing something than if someone just says straight up, I don't like your content.
Right.
For example, I started out interviewing almost exclusively music artists for about the first 40 or 50 episodes from all different genres, from rap, EDM, some classical musicians. And then I started to just get interested in more things. I saw conversations passing me by with neuroscientists and people in the fitness industry, just anyone who I legitimately thought what they did was interesting, but it didn't fit in with what I was doing. So I kind of just made the podcast more general.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had some people that I'd interviewed early on that were kind of trying to make me think I was crazy for interviewing some of the people that I did. Like I just talked to Dave Rubin a couple weeks ago, who I know you did his podcast, and
Hmm.
there are a couple people that reached out to me, and I'm guessing they don't actually consume his content. They kind of just see some things said about him in the media and said, how could you interview someone like that who's batshit crazy and alt right and all this stuff, and like that bothered me more than if they had said, I just thought your podcast with Dave Rubin was shitty. Like I thought it was just low quality content. It bothered me
Hmm.
more that they thought I was unstable in some way or just,
Hmm.
not thinking right.
Hmm. Yeah, I totally get that. I think no one wants to be thought crazy, but at the same time, there's almost nothing that's interesting to pursue in life that isn't thought crazy by some large contingent of people. Um, when I was a kid, when I was like 12 or 13, before I got super into jazz, I was really into classical music, and I wanted to be Joseph Alessi, who was the lead trombone player of the New York Philharmonic. Now that's just something I really loved, and there's a contingent of people that literally see that and they're like, what the hell is the appeal of this? This is just
Mm-hmm.
the most bizarre thing. And the same is true. I mean, there are a lot of things that I look at and I just think, what could possibly be the appeal of this activity? But it's fundamentally no different than the reverse case. We all come into loving the things that we love in different ways, and if you're someone who never found a reason to love the thing that you love, who just doesn't experience it the same way, they're often going to think that what you're doing is crazy. And if
Mm-hmm.
they have an ounce of self-awareness, then they'll have the reflective moment that I try to have, which is, there's fundamentally nothing. Well, let me put it this way. If you see someone looking at a painting at a museum, and then you look at the painting and it just appears to you like a bunch of blobs on a canvas,
Mm-hmm.
neither one of you is crazy. Neither one of you is wrong. You're just legitimately having different experiences looking at the same collection of atoms. One of you could be having, something close to a spiritual experience. And if you're that person, it's going to make total sense for you to devote a large amount of your life to trying to understand and recreate that experience for others by, say, becoming a great painter. But if you're the person who looks at it in total good faith and, gives it all your attention, and you feel nothing, then that other person is going to look crazy to you. And that's the case with every activity you can name. So someone who sees Dave Rubin and just totally doesn't get what this guy is about, seems like a right-wing nut job, they're in the position of looking at the piece of art and just not getting it. And they're not wrong either, really. When it comes to subjective aesthetic experiences, I mean, if I hear like a song by Kanye West or Chopin or whatever genre you can think of, ultimately it's irreducible why I experience it the way that I do. It can't actually be explained or conveyed to a person who doesn't experience it in such a way that they can rationally come to experience it the way that I
Mm-hmm.
do. And so I think when it comes to these things, I'm very much what the philosophers would call an aesthetic relativist. If you experience the Beatles as horrible music, I don't think you're wrong. I just think there's nothing else to appeal to in art other than your own subjective experience. So I would say remain open to everything. Understand that you're not going to like some things. You are going to like others, and that there's no right or wrong in this space, and that you should understand that the moment you view someone else as crazy for liking the aesthetic experiences that they like, from an objective point of view, you're equally open to the same charge, whoever you are and whatever
Hmm.
you like.
Yeah, the painting you mentioned is a good analogy, and I was talking to someone recently who sets up art galleries, and we kind of got into the discussion where I was asking how could someone pay so much for super simple paintings where you have a blank white canvas with a blue dot, and someone pays $30,000 for that. And she said sort of the same thing, like you don't have to like it. You're not wrong for not liking that painting, but the difference between you doing that and a masterful artist doing that same painting is that that artist understands the higher complexities of how to create color and shadow and balance, and there's a whole there are a whole bunch of levels of understanding from that artist's point of view that are inputs into his output. And if you just started painting and did that same thing, would look exactly the same. Your input is almost zero, and your output would still look similar. So for people that are truly appreciating that painting, they might say that they value it so much because that artist has understood the complexities and reduced it to something super simple, where like someone like me would just be drawing a circle on a canvas, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Totally. Yeah, I think it does go back to just subjective preferences. If you're an art aficionado, you love art and you get into a particular person and they have a piece of art that's just a square on a canvas that required no like manual dexterity or anything like that, it, I can understand how you would still be really moved by it, largely because of your knowledge of who made it and how your knowledge of the artist interacts with the piece itself, so that when both of those factors are in play, you experience the art differently than if you had just seen the art not knowing who created it.
Mm-hmm.
That's just one of those things that you either feel it or you don't. And I'm not I tend to not really feel it, but I'm not judgmental of those who do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't blame you. There's a lot of times I feel like I should feel something looking at paintings, and I don't feel it, and I I guess it's just a subjective thing where I feel like I should feel something, and everyone's standing around it in awe, and I'm just kind of looking at it, being like, "What the fuck is like? What is this? I don't know how to feel about this banana peel taped to a wall or something." Um,
Yeah.
but I wanted to go back to uh, your your writing and music, because both of those, like you explained, require different modes of uh, creativity, but both of them require focus. For you, when you're feeling like you can't get into the zone, how do you restore lost focus?
I usually don't. If I really feel like I can't focus, I stop working. That's my short answer. In general, though, I do think concentration is a muscle that can be worked on. And like other muscles, some people are born with much more of it than others. Some people, obviously have ADHD or just, attention issues, and some people are born with brains that are basically drenched in natural Adderall all the time. So you can't help that, but you can practice mindfulness. Meditation is a great concentration. It's like, bicep curls for your ability to concentrate,
Mm-hmm.
and that really can't hurt. And then there's just the fact that your attention is going to be easily focused with certain activities and really and not with others. So, for me, it's very easy to pay attention to making music and to writing because it requires no effort. The attention pays itself, in my case, because I happen to be lucky enough to do work that I'm really interested in. When I do have to do things I'm not interested in my better moments, I have to focus on focusing. And almost always, it's almost always rewarding when I am able to focus on focusing rather than just waiting for the moment to pass until I can get to the thing I really want to do. Unfortunately, usually I am waiting for the moment to pass until I can do what I really want to do, but when I remember to just allow myself to be in the moment doing the thing that is quote unquote undesirable, you can find that it's actually fun just to focus on anything at all.
Yeah, but by paying attention to what's going on, by paying attention to your senses, you can have fun sitting by yourself in a room and just kind
Yeah.
of being there.
It sounds crazy until you've done it. That's all I can say about that. And another example of this is for me studying for exams on especially if I'm cramming for an exam in any subject that's halfway interesting, really can be anything. Studying for the exam 2 or 3 weeks out would have been really boring and shitty because it would have been hard for me to focus just because I know I could be doing other things.
Mm-hmm.
But cramming for the exam the day before, it's stressful, but it's actually pleasant because I'm so focused. I'm laser focused on studying for the exam, and I'm hardly having another thought other than the material itself. So the same material, becomes much more interesting for that short period of time. And that shows you that the material itself is not what can make something interesting. It's just your ability to focus on it. And if you can train that focus directly, I think you can actually make progress on just becoming a more focused person.
What does your meditation practice look like on a daily basis?
I have no routine. I try to do it every day for 20 minutes.
Do you use an
That's
app
it.
or anything?
I like Sam Harris's Waking Up app, but I don't really use it very often. The app I used to use that I learned to meditate by using was 10% Happier, which is Dan
Mm-hmm.
Harris's
Yeah, Dan
app,
Harris.
and Joseph Goldstein has the best intro lessons in my opinion. So yeah, but usually I just set the timer.
Yeah, I use Sam Harris's app as well. And it, in the beginning, I loved his on ramp with the 50 lesson meditation because I started with just a timer at first, and I was doing it for 5 minutes a day. I was kind of frustrated, almost gave up after 2 3 weeks. I just didn't want to meditate. Like I thought I was just basically wasting my time. It's really hard for me to just sit down for even 5 minutes and feel like I was wasting my time. And once I got into waking up, and I don't know, it was the first time when I was listening to Sam Harris that someone else ever pointed out the fact that the feeling of feeling like I'm wasting my time, I could actually observe that,
Mm.
and it kind of just fades away. And you could do that with any feeling. And I've been doing it for about a year and a half now, and I'm sure you feel similarly, but just paying attention to how your feelings feel and kind of just like be, being present, almost like watching your feelings and thoughts in front of you like a river kind of just streaming by, takes away a lot of the power of the emotion. And so for something like studying, for example, now if I'm not studying anything in the college sense, but I'm still trying to learn every day. If I feel myself becoming frustrated, I'm amazed at how quickly that frustration can dissipate by just letting it kind of run through my body and feel, maybe my heart's racing, or, maybe my fists are clenched, or, I didn't realize my jaw was locked shut, or just I was thinking about something else, like how quickly that can get you back into a present state of mind where you're actually having fun and enjoying a mundane task.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think the power of meditation when done properly is, it's not an accident that it's been practiced for thousands of years, and that it's sort of swept the Western world in recent decades. There's a backlash to it because not everyone absorbs it in its deepest form, which I think is fine. To me, Sam Harris has made this analogy a lot. It's like exercise, physical exercise. Most people didn't know to physically exercise their bodies 200 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
but now we understand how important that is. And some people really absorb that lesson and run marathons and live till they're 110, and other people exercise for 10 minutes a day. And to me, that's all upside. But yeah, you can have really strange and amazing experiences just by sitting down and paying attention to the feeling of your butt in the chair, or the feeling of
Yeah.
air coming in through your nose. And it is one of those things, my whole life I think I dismissed claims like this as pure nonsense. And then, when my mother died when I was 18, I began to have panic attacks out of nowhere, kind of. And I tried lots of things to get rid of this problem. And I never had an anxiety problem as a kid, but all of a sudden I would just have these full body panic attacks as if out of nowhere, and it felt like something I would need to call 911 for, but it was totally, I was totally healthy. And eventually I became desperate enough to try meditation, just because I'd heard people claiming that somehow magically, by sitting down and paying attention to your breath, you can cure a panic disorder. Which, as I said, on its face, it sounds like a witch doctor. But I tried it, and then it actually worked. And the moment I knew that it worked was, it was just, 5 or 10 minutes into a meditation, and getting the direction to allow your feelings in, to like welcome them, to feel the wave of panic however you feel it enter you. People experience it differently. For me, it was like a tightness in my chest. To feel that feeling and mentally welcome it. And then just observe that it goes away. The key, and it is a paradox, is that the key is that you have to stop pushing it away, and then it will go away. It's totally bananas and backwards. But if you just allow it, then for whatever reason, by some law of neurophysiology, it actually does dissipate.
Mm-hmm.
And you can cease to feel it as suffering. You can just feel it as a sort of physical sensation. And my panic attacks went away. That's that the proof is in the pudding. And I met someone on a meditation retreat who had a disease, a horrible, chronically painful, degenerative disease that I don't remember the name of. He was very obese and had very labored breathing, labored walking.
Mm-hmm.
And he said the only thing his whole life that had worked in terms of mitigating the pain was meditation. And so it really can't be oversold. And I just always want to acknowledge the thought in people's heads that says, this thing sounds crazy, they're batshit, this guy's dropped too much acid, his brain is fried. Those thoughts are totally normal, and they're exactly the kinds of thoughts that, frankly, a rational person should have listening to the kinds of claims that I'm making. But just try it.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way, and I'm sorry about your mother. I've never had to deal with anything as devastating as losing a parent, so I'm sorry. And even though I haven't gone through something like that, I have had bad anxiety attacks, and that also was the starting point of me looking into meditation. I remember let me go back a little bit. So when I started smoking weed my freshman year in college, which was not often because I played baseball and we got tested by the NCAA, so we could only do it over summer breaks or winter breaks. It was a very pleasant experience. I had not had a bad high for maybe the first 2.5 years I was smoking weed. And I started to get, a little bit anxious where I would smoke and then, for the first 10 or 20 minutes I would be like on the verge of a panic attack, although I didn't know what it was at the time. I didn't know that what I was feeling was anxiety. And it would kind of dissipate and it would go back to a relaxing high. And there were other things going on in my life too that I just wasn't giving the attention that I needed to, and I wasn't acknowledging feelings and talking through things. And the end of my senior year, I had just like a full-blown panic attack after I had smoked. Like it lasted for hours, like even after I wasn't feeling high anymore. Like this my throat was closing up, my heart felt like it was beating 200 miles per hour, even though I kept checking my pulse and it didn't feel like it was going that fast. But in my chest I thought my heart was going to explode, and still I didn't say anything to my parents or anyone close to me. And then about a week later, the same feeling came back. The first time I'd ever had these symptoms, just completely sober, no drugs or anything in my system besides caffeine, which probably made it worse. Like I wasn't, I had not smoked at all. And the fact that I could feel that without being high made me even more anxious. And then I just kept, like exactly what you're saying, I kept trying to push that out of my mind. I was in the middle of a Starbucks with my brother, just kind of going through some possible job stuff after graduation. And all of a sudden, the walls literally started closing in my visual field. I'd always heard in movies people say, the walls are closing in, and I never actually understood what that meant. And I physically started to get tunnel vision, and everything disappeared. And I went outside and called my mom and told her that I think I'm dying. Like I was laughing and crying at the same time. And I was I think you have to take me to the hospital. I don't know what's going on, but I feel like my chest is going to explode. I'm breathing, but it feels like I can't. And she brought me to the hospital, and that was the first time the doctors explained, you have, that was a panic attack caused by anxiety, these sensations that you're feeling, you're fine. They were showing me my vitals on the screen, and I was so paranoid at the time. I thought that the nurses were in on it. I was so dissociated from everyone else in the hospital. In my own head, I thought how can I believe that these vitals are real? What if they're just showing me fake vitals to make me think I'm okay? And for about a month and a half, my nervous system just kind of felt on edge all the time. I felt anxious to leave my room, leave the house, all this shit. And I found this book called The Dare Approach to Anxiety. And it stands for diffuse, allow, run towards, engage, DARE and dare. And it describes a lot of what you were alluding to before, where it seems crazy to like ask your heart to beat faster or ask your throat to close up and run towards it and try to like feel it run through you. But that book saved me from having to go on any sort of medication, and I think that combined with also I discovered meditation around the same time, because I was in a similar boat where I could have easily just found myself medicating with alcohol or Xanax or something else, where I just wanted to try everything I possibly could. And meditation and the concept of running towards it if it got past that point, and actually letting it run through your body and observing the sensations and not trying to push it away was literally life changing. And I tell people the same thing. They think I'm kind of crazy when I say meditation changed my life, and just by paying attention you can be at peace.
No, yeah. I mean, there are too many similarities in your story and mine to go into in detail, but it does really sound like a crazy thing until you're... And yet, in practice, many people are just forced into trying it because all of the other options are failing. Like, you can actually try and experiment with every method of being happy in this world that's advertised, including drugs and alcohol and all of the... You can just experiment with these things. Most of them aren't deadly, and the ones that aren't deadly, you can experiment and just see if they work, right? Try drinking every day. Try smoking weed every day. And, frankly, there are some people who actually live full and great lives with a variety of different strategies, right? There's some people who actually should be smoking weed every day because the way it interacts with their system, it just actually is like useful to them. For me, I drink coffee every day, and I think that's probably a net good for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I really do encourage people to, especially people who struggle with any kind of anxiety, to experiment with these things and have a serious daily meditation practice be one of the many experiments. You just may find that it's the best, and if you don't, then that's okay too. I'm always wary of being too pushy with this kind of thing, because really people are wired very differently, and there is no one size fits all solution. But there is people are similar enough that generic advice is not totally useless. And I would just, there is a there with meditation, as I got into it more, not only did the panic attacks completely go away, I also had some pretty strange and extremely pleasant experiences meditating. At my first meditation retreat, where you just meditate for 12 or 16 hours a day and do nothing else. You don't even talk to people. Seems like it would be a perfect hell, and sometimes it is a perfect hell. But I had one experience where I was just meditating, and gradually over the course of a few minutes, my whole body lit on fire in this extremely pleasant way, in a way that if it were a drug, I would be asking, how much of this can I buy? And it was a totally, there was nothing strange about the scenario. It's the kind of thing that if I were religious, I would have interpreted as, God reaching out with his finger and touching me on the forehead.
Mm-hmm.
But my entire body was just buzzing with this amazingly pleasant energy. And the only thing that was required for me to get there was sitting in a chair and paying very close, undivided attention to the sensation of the air against my skin, for example. And every time I have a thought, just going back to that sensation. I don't know exactly what facts of the universe have conspired to make this a possible experience for creatures like ourselves, but it is a possible experience. And there's a lot to be gained from exploring it.
How long was that meditation retreat? You said you
That
didn't speak for
so that
days.
that one was a weekend. That one was just 2 or 3 days.
Have you done any other retreats?
I did one for 4 days and one for 7 days.
And those were non-speaking too?
Correct.
What do you learn from, or what did you learn from not talking for a week?
I don't. I can't say that I learned very much. I view it more like, and this is getting back to the analogy to physical exercise. I view it more like an intensive, like, you played baseball, so did you ever have like Hell Week? Where you just like trained.
First week we get back to kind of test our times and squat, mile time, kind of getting back into it. Yeah, if it wasn't that unpleasant, if you actually worked out over the summer and winter break, but if you slacked off, then it was a legitimate hell week.
Yeah. Yeah, so I view it a little bit more like Hell Week. It's in principle there's nothing different about a silent meditation retreat for a month and sitting at home and meditating for 20 minutes. The only difference is the dosage, basically, of this treatment. You just become better at it more quickly if you do it and nothing else for long periods of time. And you develop a skill that's sort of like riding a bicycle, where you can just sort of go back to it more easily. But I really think you can get a lot of the benefit just by doing it at home. It depends what kind of person you are. Certain people are more, it's easier for them to get into something alone just by virtue of being persuaded by a book or videos. And for other people, being in a group provides the motivation necessary to do the thing. So that's kind of what it comes down to, I think.
Yeah, and what you said before about the net positive and experimenting with drugs and meditation, and how different drugs or different levels of meditation, different ways you apply it are going to work differently for everybody. That reminded me of a quote from Winston Churchill that I was reading in a book called The Splendid and the Vile, and it was about the whole time of the London bombings before the United States entered World War II. And he was up late one night drinking, like he did almost every single night, and his wife gave him a really hard time that night in particular about drinking. And he said to her, "I've taken much more from alcohol than alcohol has taken from me." And I was like, wow, that's a really good way to think about drugs. If you feel like if you feel like you're taking much more away from the drug than the drug is taking from you, then that's a net positive. That's why should you stop? But if you feel like that drug is draining you, and the positive effects that you're getting out of it are long-term burning you out or demolishing your focus, then that's probably a good reason to stop.
Yeah, definitely. I think, I know at least one person who, in my whole experience of them, they could probably be classified as an alcoholic, but they become invariably more pleasant rather than less pleasant when they're drunk. They're never a mean drunk. And so they're the, you can say maybe 10 years down the line they'll start becoming a mean drunk, but maybe not. There, what you have to worry about is just the physical damage to the liver. And that's probably reason enough to kick the habit. But I am astounded by just how different people's reactions to drugs are. So my reaction to weed is the same as yours, except that the paranoid panic attacks happened for me basically from the beginning. The very first time I really got high, I had a experience that was similar to yours, where I actually thought that I might be dying, and I basically blacked out. And then it just took me hours to recover. But, more or less since then, with weed, it's always been sort of half and half, where half of my experiences will just end in pure paranoia. And if you could give me the redo button on not smoking, it would be an obvious choice not to smoke. And then half of them have been net positive experiences. But and it's really unpredictable, which way it's going to go. So in general, I just don't smoke weed. And I break that rule infrequently enough that, it's a negligible part of my life. But I do know people that honestly look into themselves, and every time they smoke weed, it's basically a positive experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I have no reason to doubt that. So you have to be really wary that you're not doing something because of peer pressure or because you think it makes you look cool. I think, a huge percentage of teenagers especially smoke weed not because they feel good, but because it looks so cool to smoke weed, and especially to enjoy smoking weed. So it gives you a huge incentive to pretend you're enjoying it when you're not. And then other people legitimately enjoy it, and perhaps it's a guilty pleasure, something they indulge in a bit too much. But then it's just in the category of, something you want to enjoy in a disciplined way. And we're all in this category with some things. For most people, sweets are in that category. You don't want to have too many cookies, but you also don't necessarily want to cut it out of your life entirely.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're just in a familiar terrain of trying to exercise some willpower. But, as long as you're not doing it for the wrong reasons, namely peer pressure, and as long as you're not, and then there are just the clear cases where someone has an addiction, and what I mean by that word is they have a self-awareness problem. Like they're convinced that their drinking isn't having any negative consequences in their life, but it's just obvious that it is. Like they got fired from their job because they were drunk during the day, or they threw up all over their friend's nice apartment and they barely remember it. And that's a case where it's just any rational person can see that your drinking is actually harming your life, but you're under the mistaken belief that it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And then there has to be some way of getting over that self-deception, realizing that it's in your self-interest to stop or to reduce or cut it out completely. And that's where, addiction programs come in. But if you're not in one of those two categories, I'm very libertarian about my attitude to drugs.
What's helped me avoid the bad high, or I don't know if bad high is the right way to describe it, but just when the weed I'm smoking doesn't have the desired effect, most of the time going into it, from a practical standpoint, I just smoked too much. I am always better off smoking a little bit and then waiting and then smoking again, which is kind of like the common wisdom for most drugs. But then I also feel almost every single time when I have had a panic experience on weed, I feel the panic before the effects of the weed start to set in. So I'll take a hit or I'll rip the bong, and immediately in my mind, I think, oh, like, what have I done? Like, I've just set myself on a roller coaster that I can't get off now.
Mm.
And then that starts to set in. So what's helped me avoid that panic that may or may not work for other people is I try to remember before I start smoking that I am smoking this weed because I want it to work in a way that will put me in the state I'm desiring, will put me in a different state. And when I feel those sensations, that means that it's working. So I may say to myself, I smoked the weed and the weed is working. And I'll just like repeat that in my head, and that kind of like mellows me out. And then before I realize it, I'm just high and not freaking out. So it may or may not work for you. That's just something that I've recognized when I freak out on weed. I start to feel the panic before the actual high sets in. And so for me, that's a signal that I'm just not in the right state of mind before I'd started smoking.
Right. Yeah, what I found is that there was no strategy that reliably worked if I was high and panicking. That's what I found. If you find a strategy that works, some way of, some mechanism for thinking your way out, or, focusing your way out, then that's great. But, it's also possible to delude yourself into feeling there's some strategy, whereas the correct strategy might just be to stop smoking the thing that's making you panic. And if you compare it, these drugs are different in ways that are understandable, even though they affect every person differently. There are generic patterns. I know very few people who take 3 shots and begin to panic. For some reason, alcohol just seems not to have that kind of effect on almost anyone.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who drink and don't feel, and what they feel as a result of the drinking is not pleasant. That's never been the case for me. So, to me, it's just all a matter of self-awareness and understanding, of trusting your sort of common sense about what you're feeling. And there's no substitute for self-awareness in these kinds of conversations. I think there are people who just tell you outright to not use a substance in principle, and I don't understand how so many people are going around drinking coffee every day, but at the same time saying, any substance that influences your consciousness is, by default bad. And I also don't know how people who recognize that caffeine has very different effects on different people wouldn't also extend that principle to alcohol and marijuana and all the rest. Because, there are actually people who, with 2 sips of a cup of coffee, will reliably have a panic attack. And there are other people who down 7 cups of coffee a day and don't feel it, which is to say they can get a full night of sleep if they have 7 espresso shots at midnight. They can go to sleep 10 minutes later. Mm-hmm. So and everything in between is possible. And so it just seems really bizarre to me that people have hard and fast generic rules for most of the typical substances that people are using. In any case, that's my take.
Yeah, a blanket statement either way, where you say anything that influences your consciousness is bad to take, or you know, take nothing is bad to take that influences your consciousness, because if you take that mindset, then for me, I can get myself into similar states of caffeine with music. Like a lot of times when it's late at night and I want to work out, instead of drinking coffee, I'll just put on a playlist that makes me feel like I just drank a cup of coffee at the gym at noon, but I don't want to disrupt my sleep cycle, because I'm not one of those people that can drink coffee and go to bed. So if you don't think that you should do things that influence your consciousness, for me, and for many other people, I assume most people, just listening to one song can swing your mood in a completely different direction, and put you in a state of mind to where you were just sitting on the couch thinking about going to bed. There was no way you were going to work out that day, and then you throw your AirPods in, listen to maybe some J. Cole or Porter Robinson, whatever is on your workout playlist, and all of a sudden you just get like charged with that energy that makes you feel like I can work out. I just crossed that threshold of the desired state that I was looking for.
Right. Yeah, and there are all these situations in life where you can almost feel as if you've taken a drug and you haven't. I mentioned the one when I was meditating. It felt. I guess there's no particular drug I could name that it felt like, or that I've done. But if you think, I can think of a lot of examples from, when I was a teenager, where I was in a room with other people, and the social vibe was so loose and so uninhibited, but not a single everyone in the room was sober. But just because of the situation, we felt we had a social permission to act in a way that was totally loose and uninhibited, which is precisely the feeling people desire out of being drunk. Right? Like you can, for all intents and purposes, be drunk or have the same lack of inhibition in a sober setting. And there are other situations where you're drinking, but the vibe is very stiff. So this is another a good sort of argument Sam Harris has, which is that everything we do is for the purpose of changing our consciousness in some way. When you're trying to cheer someone up, what are you trying to do except change their consciousness? And when you're trying to cheer yourself up, and when you go for a run, this is everything we're doing is broadly for that purpose. And drugs are just one set of tools that allow us to do that. And each tool is different, and each tool interacts with each person's mind in a different way. And so I think you have to experiment with these things responsibly, of course, but I think you do risk missing out if you don't experiment at all.
What do most people get wrong about you?
It's hard to answer unless I'm thinking of like what kind of people, like Twitter people.
Yeah, let's go with Twitter people. Since you've garnered more attention than most people who are your age, and that's a great thing, and that comes with a lot of cool responsibility, but that also comes with a lot of people making judgments about you that otherwise wouldn't have anything to judge. So Twitter's a good example of a space where you can exert your thoughts and anyone is on the same level. You just put in your email and you make an account, and someone gets a notification, whether it's a celebrity or just me sitting in my apartment. I get the same notification they do when someone presses at.
Yeah, no, Twitter is yeah, it is what you say it is. So I don't, people have very different opinions of me. Some people I feel understand me really well, and they understand, sort of both of my passions, both writing and music. I think there are other people who really understand the one and not the other. Um, and there are some people who, just fundamentally think I'm a grifter, that I am just saying things that white conservatives want to hear because I want money and fame and attention. And there's very little hope of persuading a person like that to take me seriously or to have a charitable interpretation of my being and my passions. But yeah, I mean, the problem, especially the topics I write about, are, unfortunately very controversial, even though I'm never consciously trying to be controversial. I'm often just trying to say things that would make sense if I were talking to a smart friend about a particular issue.
Mm-hmm.
But the way American history has gone, it just turns out, well, let me put it this way. Every society in history has had its set of deep taboos, of subjects that are extremely emotionally charged. And what particular subjects those are have varied as much as possible. So that, I was recently reading Tocqueville, and there's a sentence he has at the beginning of a chapter. He's writing in the 1830s from the perspective of a Frenchman. And he says something like, "What I'm about to say will no doubt offend people immensely." And then he goes on to say something sort of very innocuous sounding about like democracy and separation of powers or something. Something that would go down smooth with, whether or not you agreed with it, would go down smooth from like a offense taking perspective with any modern observer. And I thought that was funny because, he was clearly bracing himself for a blow for saying something that just sounded totally commonplace. And when you live in a particular society that has a particular set of taboos, it's hard to create the distance from which you can view the taboos of your time as ultimately arbitrary. But I do try to do that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, like you're not trying to stir up controversy, but the things that you write about and the way in which you write about it, it's like we don't have a language to discuss some of these things without seeming controversial or without people making assumptions about you. And yeah, like it just seems like in a lot of areas we lack the language to talk about things. Like I was just I was listening to Eric Weinstein talk to the author of Hillbilly Elegy, and I apologize because I'm blanking out on the author's name.
J.D. Vance?
Yes, yeah. And he was talking about how now we don't really have a language for talking about the struggles of middle class white America, and it's hard for a white person to talk about the struggles of middle class whiteness without seeming like you're disregarding black people or some other race. Like to just talk about it and acknowledge it without seeming like you're coming from some like you're asking for anything in return. And you also write a lot about race in America, and you've talked about the problem of violent crime in the black community, and that also seems like a subject where there's a disconnect between the facts and what people are willing to talk about just because something seems controversial or we don't have a language to talk about it. Like the mainstream concerns of racism, the mainstream concerns of anti-black racism don't match the real life suffering of black people. And so if you took those two things and you matched up police shootings, which is awful. If a black kid gets shot uh, for no reason by a police officer and he was killed wrongly, that is not happening in huge numbers. Yet it takes over the majority of the mainstream discussion. But something like violence in the black communities and black on black violence and why are black teenagers killing each other happens much more frequently, yet no one talks about it. And when you take something like what J.D. Vance was talking about, like the struggles of a white middle class America and the struggles of being a black kid growing up in, Southside Chicago or wherever and worrying about not getting shot by another black kid because that's who you really have to worry about shooting you. It's like we don't have the language to discuss that.
Yeah, we've certainly since the 1960s we've become very good as a country, especially elites and the media, at having the conceptual vocabulary to understand when a white person kills a black person because they were afraid or biased or racist. When an event like that happens, it gets elevated to a national story. People understand it instinctively as evil. It gets condemned by the most important politicians in the country. And it's understood as a massive concern and something that should be avoided and something that we should devote time and attention to preventing. But we really don't know how to talk about the fact that murder is the number one cause of death for young black men. And it's not the number one cause of death for any other race of young men. Not only is it the number one cause of death, it's a larger cause of death, for black men in their early 20s than the other top 9 causes combined. So, the problem is the moment you begin mentioning this, I think many people, the hair on their skin begins to raise. And they begin picturing the ugly history of criminalizing black men. And so it becomes impossible to say, this is actually the much bigger problem. It's not just the lives lost. It's the fact that in high crime communities, businesses don't want to enter and open branches in those communities. Grocery stores have to charge higher prices to compensate for theft and burglary. And therefore, people in those neighborhoods pay more for the same things. There are fewer jobs because businesses won't move in. Crime has a cost that is really massive and underreported. If you own property in a high crime community, as many black people do, the value of that property is almost directly tied to the crime rate. But inversely, as the crime rate goes down, your property value will go up. So if we care about the racial wealth gap, as it's often framed, it's inconsistent to not care about crime, and in particular violent crime. But you're right when you say we don't we don't have the sort of simple concepts and phrases to understand or care about these, these issues in the media. There's when a black kid kills another black kid, you just don't see Rachel Maddow and everyone on CNN making a stink about it, which they will do if a white person kills a black person. But that's, ultimately a life is a life, and everyone would acknowledge that fact in the abstract, but we actually behave as if it really matters whether a person was killed by someone with white skin or someone with black skin. And that's something we have to get over.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know what it is. And, you mentioned Rachel Maddow. A lot of the things she says, granted, are, calculated to excel in the structure and corporations that she's a part of. So she's doing what she has to do to get attention. But I don't think her lack of talking about black kids getting shot has anything to do with her not seeing the humanity of black people. Like, I think if you played videos for people of a black kid getting shot and a white kid getting shot, I don't think there would be much of an observable difference in their emotional reactions and, the things that kind of go on in their brains. And, maybe they've done studies on racial violence. I'm sure they have. I'm just not aware of the results, but I would think that most people's emotional reaction would be pretty similar where they see people of different races getting harm done to them, where that would generate a very emotional reaction where you want to stop this. Like, you empathize with that person and you say, what can I do to stop this? But then I think a lot of white people, especially in the media, do calculations of, if I talk about this, how racist will I seem, even if this is something that I know it deserves to be talked about, that I know is harming black people, that I know is an issue that if we dedicated more media time to it would improve human lives. How racist will I seem to how racist will I be perceived as when I start talking about this? And many times I think that calculation, whatever the critical mass of that calculation is, like, outweighs their willingness to talk about these problems. Like, I heard Mark Norman make a joke that illustrates this. It was pretty funny. He said, if he sees a white person walking down the street, and Mark Norman is white, for those people who are listening that haven't seen his comedy, he says, if I see a white person walking down the street and they're wearing a sketchy outfit, like they're wearing a hood, they have both hands in their pockets, they just have sketchy body language, and if it's a white person wearing that and acting like that, he'll cross the street and not think twice about it. But if he sees a black person wearing the same outfit, same body language, like same sketchiness, demeanor, before he crosses the street, if anyone is around him, he will think, and even the person who's the actual guy walking towards him or girl walking towards him, he will think, how racist does this make me look right now if I cross the street? And the joke was that I'd rather get stabbed than look racist. And but I think that's, like, kind of true. Like, a lot of white people think that way, and when you're on the media, that's even magnified more. Like, if I start talking about this, or if I do this, even though I know it's preserving human life, whether it's my own or someone else's, how racist am I going to seem when I do this? And that acts as a barrier.
Definitely. And from each person's rational self-interest, I can understand why you would want to do almost everything in your power not to seem racist in the year 2020, especially at a time when we've defined racist so widely as to encapsulate a whole set of behaviors that wouldn't have been seen as racist by even the civil rights era leaders like Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin. So, if you think about what's, given that homicide is the number one cause of death for young black men, you would expect that in the era of Black Lives Matter, if that slogan means anything, that there would be some kind of nationwide movement to find wise, ethical solutions to this problem. Similar to how we attacked drunk driving in the 80s, and you had groups like Mothers Against Drunk Driving that sort of gained national attention for, and much deserved national attention for sort of being the ethical face of this movement. Thinking of a mother who lost her son or daughter because someone got behind the wheel of a car drunk. There's another group called Mothers Against Senseless Killings, plural, which is a group of mostly black mothers who have, in many cases, lost their children to stray bullets, which happens all the time as a result of gang warfare. And if you were to ask, why is it that a group like Mothers Against Senseless Killings, which no sane person could ever say, that's not an important group, why isn't it that they have the kind of national profile that Mothers Against Drunk Driving has? And the answer is very simple. Drunk driving, of course you can find drunk drivers of every race, but disproportionately it's a white crime if you look at the FBI data. When you picture a drunk driver, the face that comes to mind, frankly, is a white male. And that's a picture that's, it's a stereotype, but it's a true stereotype to the extent that you look at the rates of of drunk driving by race. Now, when you picture a child hit by a stray bullet, the picture that comes to mind is a black male in his 20s. And that too is a stereotype, but it's also a true stereotype in the sense that if you look at the data, you are going to find a racially disproportionate incidence of homicide by race. We're talking about black Americans make up about 14% of the nation, but about 51 or 52% of both victims and perpetrators of homicide. So that's a huge disproportion. And so the simple reason why a group like Mothers Against Senseless Killings couldn't possibly have a national profile in our current cultural environment is because the perpetrators have the wrong skin color. Now, if you had to explain that to an alien from outer space, it would seem totally crazy that the level of melanin in the skin of the average person pulling the trigger would be a reason to not organize around this issue and come up with solutions. That would just sound like insanity. But that actually is the status quo. And that has to change. And unfortunately, it requires moral courage on the part of individuals to change that. But I suppose we have to demand it.
Yeah. I think comedy is also a huge part of that, too. Guys like Mark Norman that are willing to talk about it, may not be able to tell those jokes on late night, but a lot of the realizations that I've come to recently, and it's probably also because I've been watching a lot of stand-up comedy in quarantine, is just looking at some of the silliness in the world through the lens of comedy. Like you were saying, if an alien came down and saw that we were treating mothers against, what was the organization again? Mothers Against Senseless
Mothers
Killings
Against Senseless Killings.
and Mothers Against Drunk Driving differently. It would seem silly to them. They wouldn't have any concept of why that's happening. And I think comedy is good at doing that, where it kind of makes you see the silliness in things and gives you an entry point to where you can comfortably maneuver it into people's consciousness and let them kind of chew on it themselves, rather than saying, you should think this way, or you need to do this in order to change the national conversation or whatever outcome it is that you desire. I think comedy and what makes great comedians so good is that they tell jokes and they kind of slide in the silliness of our dumb preconceived notions, or the things that we just do traditionally that don't question our unexamined actions, like you were saying before. And they give you a perspective to laugh at them, or say, like, how fucking stupid is it that we do this, or how silly is this, or can you believe that this is a thing that people act like this. And if that person is you, it's definitely made me think about my actions pretty profoundly, in a way that I don't know if I would have thought about them if it wasn't brought to me through like a comedic entrance first. If someone just told me that I was wrong, would I have thought about it the same way? I don't know if I would have.
Definitely, yeah. That's the power of comedy. If you can make someone laugh at a joke. You can make someone laugh at a joke that has a political valence that's actually contrary to a person's politics, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a laugh is, it can't be faked. It can't really be held down. Funny is funny. It's an amazingly honest medium. I love stand-up comedy.
Yeah, and I love comedy because there's no party. It's just funny. Like the things that Democrats and Republicans do, if you had what was funny in the middle, that's constantly going to shift, where like Democrats are going to do more stupid shit, Republicans are going to do more stupid shit through the lens of time. So I think now we're definitely in a spot where you can make fun of a lot of the things that people do on the left, and with like cancel culture and safe spaces and a lot of things. I don't think that's necessarily comedians going after people on the left. I think that maybe people on the left are just doing more things that seem absurd right now, and then 20-30 years maybe that will shift back. But comedy is ruthless, and it doesn't care what what color skin you have, or who you vote for. If you're doing something that deserves to be made fun of, good comedians will tear you apart for it.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's been a lot to make fun of on the left since about 2013, 2014, especially on race and gender issues. And there's, of course, been a hell of a lot to make fun of on the right since 2016, since we elected, celebrity apprentice to the presidency. And I remember there being a lot to make fun of on the right in the 2000s, with the, very sort of Christian approach to politics that was more in vogue, or more important then, I think, than it is now. But yeah. Anyway, this has been really fun. Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Yeah, of course. I just realized we're 10 minutes over time, so I'll let you go, and I appreciate you hopping on the podcast, and this was a blast. So thanks again, and congrats on graduating.
Thank you.